to one of our Hubby Memorial Library events. We have another banned book event today, and this time we have librarian Ash Garcia, who is a graphic novels geek, and he's just going to tell us all about his graphic novels that are banned and why they're being banned. So, hi, Ash. Thank you for coming with us today.
Hey, nice to be here.
Yeah, just take it away.
Okay. So, in this case, we know when Cindy asked me about it, I kind of went in and looked at all the different graphic novels that I'm familiar with, and ones that are really important, ones that are really started things off kind of in the 80s as far as like the graphic novels go, and also to make sure to look and see why some of them were banned. Because there's lots of graphic novels that no one has no issue with whatsoever. Um, and so these that I'll talk about are the ones that, have been challenged or banned in the United States. And of course, some of them are banned in different countries and stuff like that too, for various reasons, but we were just focusing mostly on the United States. Um, and what I was telling you, Cindy, earlier, is that what I'll start off with is basically like when some of these, especially what they're called like the big three, it really started some of the more graphic novel, um, the not a movement, but starting to do it more. The industry went, and comic industry in this case, the comic book industry, um, had like they followed what was called the Comics Code Authority. It was self-regulating. It was their own industry. There had been like what's the word? A moral panic in the 50s dealing with comic books from this one. Basically, he was a quack psychologist that basically said comic books make people into ne'er-do-wells and what are other antiquated terms and, miscreants and things like that. So there was a Senate hearing and stuff like that. But the comic companies themselves say, you know what, instead of getting, before we get censored, before we get um, restrictions on us, let's just form our own authority so that we can regulate ourselves. And so they did, and that was one of the things that they adhered to up until very recently, as in maybe 2014, maybe 2010. So, like for example, I have a list of some of the rules that you had to abide by. And there were some comic books, for example, they didn't need it. Like there's one that was that they did like the golden books, the little golden book stories for comic books. They didn't need it because for the most part, there was nothing to have to worry about. Um, there was one that they did classic stories and like Shakespeare and stuff like that. So again, even though there is sex and violence in Shakespeare, it wasn't really depicted or anything like that. So there was a few they didn't need it, so they didn't use it. So, but just a few of them. But like for example, like one of the first one, and this was 1954 when it was established. Says crime shall never be presented in such a way as to create sympathy for the criminal, to promote distrust to the forces of law, and justice, or to inspire others with a desire to imitate criminals. So, like that was one of them. Um, in every instance, good shall triumph over evil, and the criminal punished for his misdeeds. So, if you had that Joker in that case, for example, do something vile and evil, he had to be punished for it. There was no getting away with it. Um, now, and see, at the time when this moral panic happened, it wasn't really the superheroes that were causing trouble. It was things like horror comics, and crime detective comics, and things like that. So the actual superhero, it wasn't that big of a deal. It was all the others that they had trouble with. So, for example, it says no comic magazine shall use the word horror or terror in its title. Um, Scenes dealing with or instruments associated with Walking Dead, torture, vampires and vampirisms, ghouls, cannibals, and werewolfisms are prohibited. Things like that. It's a fairly long list. I mean, a lot of things having to do with morality and sex, of course, and things like that. And remember, it is in 1954, so things are uh, pretty cut and dry. Although, like, there is a funny part. For example, one of the DC comic people, DC Comics, like Superman, Batman, one of the writers, um, his last name, his real last name, is Wolfman. And so when they presented it, it said a story presented by a Wolfman, capital W O, and the Comics Code Authority had a problem with that because they're like, well, that's a werewolf. You can't have that on there. And so they had a battle with him saying that's his actual last name. I mean, we can't do anything about that. So they did like, and then they did bend to that and say, okay, well, you got to say that that is the author. Um, and then towards the like 70s, they kind of relaxed things a little bit. Um, where like you could have a little bit of sympathy for some crimes that the criminal did, if you know, but they still had to be punished for it. And like by that time, for example, I guess I can. There's a good example. Magneto, who's the X-Men villain at that time. So a lot of times he's causing these crimes because of a misguided sense of trying to protect other mutants. He's trying to keep his people, so to speak, safe. In his origin story, he was like a Holocaust survivor, and so he doesn't want his other mutant family to basically be destroyed. So in that case, his crimes, while they're still crimes, may be a little bit more. May be more sympathy for why he's doing it. But in the end, you still have to follow these rules. Like what was the other one? One that didn't get approved. It was towards the early '80s, I believe. That they came to Stan Lee for Marvel Comics and Spider-Man. They wanted them to do an anti-drug series, and in it, you got to show drug use, and that was one of the things that was not prohibited. But it was, very ugly drug use. They made it look very, very bad, as they were trying to do. So in that case, Stanley said, this isn't for any other purpose than to help people or to prevent people from using drugs. So if they don't want us to, or if they won't permit it, then well, too bad. We're just gonna do it anyway. So, like, there was nothing that prevented anyone from having to abide by what they did in the comics or anything like that. It was just self-regulation, um, to again keep the government from coming in and doing something. Um, and like I said, it stayed that way up until about 2010, between 2010 2014, then it kind of just went away. As in, no one's using it anymore. No one. It's antiquated. It doesn't fit with what we're doing now. So with that in mind, like the ones I'm gonna start with though, they're not really they're not superhero types at all. In fact, they're more like they're personal stories. Um, like the first one, and is the one by Marjane Strappi, called Persepolis. And Persepolis deals with Marjane as she's growing up in Iran as a little, as a young girl. And she is from a more privileged um, family, and so she has a lot of access to education, a lot of access to resources. I think she speaks French because she's like French Iranian. Um, but it deals with uh, like with protests starting with against the Shah of Iran, and then after that, it starts dealing with the Islamic Revolution, the Iranian Revolution, and how women are then treated after this. Um, in fact, I guess it's an autobiography in this case in comic book form or in a graphic novel form. In fact, one of the things it said, it's a word that I've never heard before called Bildungsroman. It's a German word, which basically means it focuses on the psychological and moral growth of the protagonist from childhood to adulthood, and which character change is important. And term comes from German word Bildung, like education or forming, and the Roman word novel. But it's her story of growing up. And as far as why I was challenged, it does show, and that was one of the reasons, depictions of torture. And part of that is part of what was happening during the Iranian Revolution. There was murder, there was torture, there was killings. One of her, at the same time, they are right after they're in a war with Iraq. And so, for example, in one of the scenes, her neighbor's house is hit by an Iraqi missile. And for whatever reason, their house is fine. But her friend's house is destroyed and her body is there in the rubble. And there's things that, she shows in her comics that, again, were part of her life. And so as far as like why banned, why, restricted, that was one of the reasons, mostly in that case for that. There is one, I think actually it was one of the libraries or school districts here in Texas. In 2014, it was challenged for basically being showing, from what I understand, right, Islamic religion, just in general. So, but that one didn't go anywhere. I think it was voted down like 6-1 or 5-1, where it didn't go anywhere. But some of those are like, in that case, it was. It's not like your usual type of graphic novel that people think of, like superheroes or stuff like that. It's just her retelling of the history that she lived and went through. And in the same respect, in another one, and this one came out. Oh, and by the way, Persepolis, I don't know if I mentioned, it came out in 2000. This one that came out. So the other one, Mouse, by Art Spiegelman. And that one is, I want to say, like 1985. I didn't put the date, but it's one of the first kind of big graphic novels that kind of changes things. Again, this one is not about superheroes. It's about Art. He's telling his story of the stories his father told him of enduring and getting through like a concentration camp. And at the same time, he's dealing with his mom had committed suicide a few years before. So it's almost like, a type of therapy for him. He's telling these stories about his father in a concentration camp and his mother as well. And at the same time, he does not have a really good relationship with his father. So sometimes it depicts that too. And the way he decided to express it, or do it in this case in the comic book form, is that he depicted them as mice, and Germans in a case as cats. And all these other groups are kind of anthropomorphic animals. Like I think he has the Poles as pigs, for example. What does he shows? I think he shows Americans as like different type of, if I remember, it's been a long time since I saw this one. I read it as like different variations of dogs. And it was his way as far as just telling the story of maybe not making it so difficult of a subject it is. Plus, some of it, this is his own. It's about his own life as well. In fact, there's a part in there where when he appears in it, he is a human wearing a mouse mask. So he kind of, and as well, sometimes there was like some of the Poles and some of the Germans that were depicted as heroes for trying to save Jews and for trying to keep them safe. Um, and when you look at it, sometimes, you know, the animals are kind of like mixed up, is in the way that he draws them. And part of that was, I think, as far as like race goes, that after a while, they all kind of don't have individual looks, as in, they merge a little bit. And he was kind of commenting on that's why some of the race thing is kind of ridiculous, as in the end, you're just still drawing different variations of the anthropomorphic animal. Um, so as far as like it being banned and challenged, well, obviously just the Nazi symbolism alone. Although in that case, it was about his story. Some people did have an issue in that the way that he was using stereotypical animals to depict particular groups. Um, in his mind, it was like, well, if that's how they're going to depict it, well, just use it. And also, even just there's scenes of violence, there's scenes of torture. There is some nudity, although it has to be more like in the Schindler's List, for example. If you ever saw the movie, there is nudity and violence. It's nothing that is salacious. It's nothing. But it is part of the story that unfortunately is what he's telling. Um, Part of it is also he's telling the story of his father. So it wasn't his story; it was his father's story. And sometimes I think he even mentions that what his father remembers may not be exactly correct, but it is to what is as best of his ability. Um, and part of it, and I had never heard this part before until I was investigating it. That he also talks basically in this case about a generational trauma, and that this didn't happen to him; it happened to his father. But his father then was a completely changed person from the person that went into the camp and came out. And that trauma kind of, is then passed on and has to deal with it. And it kind of is his way of, in a way, a little bit like therapy of trying to just express um, what he did. But at the time, that was extremely unusual to have um, all of it when superheroes are super popular, a graphic novel that just immediately does really well and all that has nothing to do with superheroes, and has a very difficult subject to deal with. But that is one of the, as they call it, the big three that started some of this graphic novel as a different form of medium other than the comic book. And also at the time, I think there was even people that did not like it depicted as a comic book because it was such a serious topic. But he did win a Pulitzer actually for it because of the, you know, it was a different medium to tell the story versus just text and things like that. Um, so, like I said, that was one of them. Like there was another one, um, Sandman. Sandman, and that one I read too, and it's been so many years. So I went and actually I listened to it again. It's on Audible now. And I was rereading it again. It's been many years. Sandman was very interesting in that the people that, or the demographic that Sandman attracted was very different than the normal demographic. It was DC, so it was made by the people that do Superman, Batman, that type of thing. But it deals with dream, the the embodiment of dreams. He's one of what they call the endless, of a group of entities that have been around for billions of years, and they're like um, dreams, death, his sister's death, his older sister, um, desire, fate, things like that. Um, and in this case, the story starts off where this cult person in 1917 tries to summon death to bind her so that he would never die. But then he accidentally gets Dream here, or Morpheus is his name, but he has so many other names. And he's held captive in basically someone's uh, under their house for like 70 years. Um, and it deals with when he finally gets out, and when they release him, and like he had certain things, he had certain artifacts with him that he used. He used like he had a helm that almost like some type of animal. And he had like an amulet that helped him make dreams and stuff like that. Um, and while it does deal in that DC world, like in fact some of it, there's some scenes in Arkham Asylum, which is um, a Batman thing. Um, it deals more with him as an entity and and things like that. And to mention the author, so Neil Gaiman is the author for that one. And Neil Gaiman, from this particular comic or a graphic novel, you get a bunch of different spawns off, or what? Not spawns off, but other characters that are made, and actually a few TV shows from me. Because one of the people that he deals with in here is Lucifer. And it's the same Lucifer that if you ever watched the TV show, it's the same person. It's the same character made by Neil Gaiman. Obviously, it's based on the biblical one, but he's a bit different. The way that he makes him very, in this case, angelic looking, except he has huge leather black wings from being in hell and for rebelling and things like that. Um, and did Sandman came out in 89. Okay, 89. And it went through all the way 96 or 97, if I remember right. And the demographic at the time for most comic book users was kind of like an older teenager male, maybe a younger teenage male. However, for Sandman, the demographic was a young woman. The average demographic was someone a young woman in her early 20s, maybe even mid 20s. So it was like they were really surprised. It's like, how did this happen? In fact, Neil Gaiman wasn't really expecting much at all from it. He just thought it'd be fun to tell the story, and he liked the concept, and he liked the characters, and it kind of spawned off a lot of other um, uh, books for him, for example. And I don't know if that was one of them, but like, for example, there's a book he wrote called American Gods. And if you ever read that, or watch it, it was on, I think, Showtime. Um, it deals with some of the same things. Like in American Gods, there's a god for, is Odin, who's kind of like fading. And there's new gods, one like deals with technology, and one deals with internet and TV, and several different versions of Jesus, um, because of the way that they're like with them, gods are formed by how people think and what they believe in, and so these people become actual entities, actual um, creatures, not creatures, but because like in this case, Sandman's not even a god; he's beyond that. He's just an entire entity. Um, and in there, at the same time, he sometimes gets visited by his older sister, Death. And Death, she looks like a young goth girl. She's kind of chalk white skin, but she wears like kind of a black like midriff shirt. Remember, this was kind of like the late '80s, like black leather blue jeans and big boots, and she goes around doing her job. It's her job. She doesn't quite at the like her job, but she has to do it, and she's very what do you call it? She's very happy to the people she's about to uh, take, and not to be ugly. She's just trying to, welcome them back home, because in the graphic novels, death brings you at birth and then takes you back to the afterlife at death. And so she sees you twice, although you don't remember the first time. And then in times where, we'll see you again, you'll be back again. So things like that. So she kind of keeps it cheerful and tells people, like there's one where there's a scene in there where a boy basically dies and she has to take him. And she's kind of like, that's all I get. That's all I get as far as life. And she's like, well, just like anyone else, you get a lifetime, no more, no less. And there's another character that I think he's managed to live like 15,000 years. And he says, well, I did pretty good, 15,000 years. And she's like, you got a lifetime, no more, no less. So that's kind of how she looks at it. And as far as like why that one was banned, um, it basically started off as a horror um, comic. The person that trap Dream takes some of his items, and one of them is he's psychotic. He's in Arkham Asylum, and he manages to come across some incredible artifacts from Dream, and he starts trying to make everyone dream his psychotic dreams. And they're nightmarish. They're terrible, and he makes people act out and do things and stuff like that. And so Dream has to go basically get these items back and to fight them and things like that. Um, and so some of the depictions are of of sex and of violence and things like that. And at the time, remember how we were talking about the Comic Code Authority. And so some of these are completely against, probably at least 70% of the things here on the list. But it was made at the time to be different from comic books. And it was marketed and sold as basically um, for older audiences, for more mature audiences. So it wasn't meant, and I'm trying to think, I think mine was even shrink wrapped when I bought it at the comic book store, as in it had plastic on it, if I remember right. Um, but it's a good story and is well written. And actually, if you read the novelization, or listen to the audible of it, for example, um, Neil Gaiman's just a really good writer, and it's just kind of translated into that as far as the into the story. Um, and what was the other one? Let's see. The other one I was going to talk about. Oh, so The Dark Knight Returns. And actually, I think I had put Batman: The Killing Joke and Batman: The Dark Knight Returns, but in Batman: The Dark Knight Returns, that again, also about same time period, so 1986, deals with Batman, who's an older man now. He's like in his mid 50s. He's kind of retired. Um, Superheroes have been outlawed for the most part, except for Superman. He's the only one that's sanctioned. Um, and there's a lot of crime in Gotham, and basically, uh, things come back, and I mean, Batman comes back, and he's dealing with being an older person and getting beat up. Although he was always getting beat up sometimes, with this time, it's been a while. So it deals with um, a lot of very adult themes. Um, and it deals with a lot of violence. There's a lot of, it shows some of the different gangs um, that are like, some are part of like the Joker, even though Joker's no longer a part of it. He's kind of just in a insane asylum, comatose, because Batman's retired, so he retired almost. Um, and the depictions in that case, and as far as being banned, again, the violence, the different uh, aspects of showing Batman in the case more of a as a vigilante, which he is, but even more so as like in that way. At the same time, and about the same time, there was Batman: The Killing Joke, and that one deals with kind of like the origin stories of Joker, and it's indicated in there that this is one maybe possible origin story. It doesn't say it doesn't say that it actually is. Although for the most part, people treat it as that. But it basically deals with an average man having a really bad day, and basically something, it just snaps because he's gone through so much. He's has everything happen all at one time, like the death of his wife and death of his unborn child and all this other things going on, and he just becomes the Joker. Although they even use that in like several different movies where um the Joker says that's how he became about, but also that he doesn't quite remember. It's like it could be, but he's not sure because he's lost his mind. And in this case, he's kidnaps Barbara Gordon, who is Jim Gordon's daughter, and shoots her, paralyzes her, and tries to and takes photos of her and tries to make Jim Gordon crazy too, to trying to prove a point that anyone can go bad from having too much happen to them. In fact, that one, Barbara Gordon is Batgirl. And so when she's paralyzed, she's no longer Batgirl because she's paralyzed. And she becomes a whole other character. Because I don't know if you remember, I don't know, most people remember, in the comics, Batgirl's a librarian. And in this case, it's she becomes what's called the Oracle. And she becomes like a computer person, like a hacker person that is able to infiltrate through all the different navigate all the different systems and all the different information, and basically be the person that if you need something about someone or to help other superheroes, she's the one you go to. As far as being the information person, as far as that goes, which fits for a librarian. And she's depicted in her wheelchair, and she's part of a group eventually called the Birds of Prey, which are different other superhero heroines like Huntress and Black Canary, all birds in that case. um, and she's basically their leader, and uh, kind of sets up where they're going, kind of like in as their commander in a way. Um, but in that case, the violence, the the whole just depiction of her being shot, and then the photos taken of her. Um, that obviously, again, the Comic Code Authority, that goes way, way over the line for some of those things. But it's a story of someone that's psychotic and someone that wants to think that other people will react the same way. In the comics, Jim Gordon doesn't, though. He doesn't become psychotic. He stays, he's traumatized, but he doesn't turn to anything else other than what he always has been, which is a good man. Just, it kind of ruins Joker's whole idea that anyone can turn just for having a bad day. Um, and the last one, which is again, this is also one of the big three. So it was Mouse, The Dark Knight Returns, and Watchmen are kind of the ones that kind of change graphic novels. So the Watchmen is kind of weird in that it was meant as an assignment, or not assignment, but there was a comic book company called Carlton. Carlton had a few comic book characters, superhero characters, but the comic company went out of business. And so DC bought the characters. So they were able to take the characters, and they said, well, maybe do something with them, maybe to give more of an audience for them. And the Watchmen is by so Alan Moore, David Gibbons, John Higgins. Those are the Alan Moore's the writer. Dave and John are the illustrators for it. They said, okay, how about we have a concept where the beginning of the story is one of the superheroes' murder, and how it all comes about and things like that. ultimately, though, they didn't use any of the characters that they got from Carlton. They just made their own, and they made them almost like, well, almost like a satire on superheroes. Um, to put it bluntly, none of them are good people. They are humans with a lot of flaws. Um, and the world in which they are in is different. It's kind of like an alternative world. So, like in their world, for example, um, there is only one superhero that actually has real powers, and his powers are just beyond anything. He can manipulate all matter of any type. So he's godlike. He doesn't even live in the present. He lives all at once throughout all of the time, all of his existence. So he doesn't even think anymore like normal humans. But of all things, they enlist him to help fight, or Nixon does, in Vietnam. And so in that world, America wins with his help, and his name's Dr. Manhattan. is, is his character name. We win Vietnam, and then actually eventually in that world, Vietnam becomes the 51st state. Um, and in that world, Watergate is never exposed because one of the characters, one of the superheroes, is basically a mercenary who will do anything that he's told. He doesn't really have much of a moral compass other than staying uh, in the law as far as being sanctioned. Um, so in that one, the Watergate never happens because um, the reporters who investigated Watergate are murdered. He has them executed. And so in his world, Nixon also gets the 22nd Amendment repealed. And so he's on his fifth term. Although part of that, and this is said in 1986, so part of that, Alan Moore said, he just didn't want to deal with having Reagan as the president then because it could be good or bad, but it might hurt sales as well. So he just came up with his own alternative history, just to avoid current politics, just to get out of there. He figured that most people didn't like Nixon, so might as well, you could use that as a as an easy way to unite people as far as that goes, as far as like not liking him. But a lot of the characters again are the superheroes are really flawed. They start it kind of there's like a superhero movement where it starts off in I think the 30s or 40s, and they're basically just crime fighters in costumes. They don't actually have any real superheroes other than either they can give a beating really well or they can take a beating real well. In fact, one of the characters, the owl, he's kind of based on one of the Carlton characters called the Blue Beetle. It's the Blue Beetle that there was the movie just a few months ago, or the old Blue Beetle anyway. And like he just has a bunch of owl themed gadgets and he can fight and stuff like that. Um, the comedian is based on they kind of made him like a Nick Fury, except kind of like evil, but within the law evil. Um, and in the story, one of the other superheroes who he has a funny idea of what of his he's like the smartest man in the world, and he uses 100% of his brain. Although it's been like that's like a myth where people they talk about humans only using like 10% of their brain power or 20% of their brain power, and actually the reason why is because the rest of the brain is doing other things like keeping your heart going and running all the rest of your body. So of course it is your brain has other things to do, and it's doing it. So they just kind of use that aspect to him. But he hatches a plan because at the time in that world, um, they're about to have a nuclear war with Russia, and he comes up with an idea that if they could something were to happen, that the superpowers would unite against that instead of and have a common enemy instead of each other, and hopefully that would solve any of the but it's going to be a nuclear war. And of course, in the 80s, that was a big deal. That was, and it's still going to be a big deal, but that was always in the back of the average person's mind. So what he hatches a plan is that he will create a catastrophe and blame Dr. Manhattan for it, who is basically omnipotent. And in this point, not even really having to do much with humans anymore. Because he doesn't relate to them. One of his girlfriends is one of the like superhero people, but he kind of just not into it anymore. It's just petty little problems from humans that he doesn't care. So the character decides that he'd be perfect to blame for it. Well, when this all comes about, the comedian, that's the one that's kind of the bad version of Captain America almost. He kind of figures it out fairly quick what's going on, and so he's murdered. Um, I forgot the character's name, of course. He murders him to keep him from talking. And he was the only one that could basically, you see, the comedian was able to see anything for what it is, even if it's something bad about him or about someone else. He never saw the world as through false glasses. He was very realistic, knew exactly what's going on, even if, and that was kind of the thing in there, that because he sees everything and how things really are, he considers the whole world because of his cynical attitude. But by the time everyone else finds out and they confront him, um, everything's already happened. Um, the what happened was he created through genetic engineering this huge, like, tentacled monster and made it look like it had come in from another dimension and basically set off a blast in New York, killing millions of people, just like that. And by the time they confront him, um, he's like, "Do you think I would have done all this and start talking to you about it if it didn't already happen? You would have been able to stop me." And so he's like, "Turn on, look, it's already happened. It's too late." Um, and it works as far as that goes, is that, yeah, millions have been killed, and Russia and United States are now in unison and agreement that the real enemy is, in that case, Dr. Manhattan. So they cease all hostilities towards each other to focus on the the bad guy, who they believe is a bad guy. And and kind of that, when I was reading that, as far as like the Comics Code Authority, about the villain can't get away with being a villain, and that one he did. He was the villain. He did get away with it. And they all agree that it was better to just not say anything, except for one character, um, Rorschach. And Rorschach is he's a weird character. He's like basically a sociopath. And he has a very black and white idea of criminal and crime and morality, and basically he thinks you're a criminal, he'll burn you to death, or he'll just stab you to death, or like I said, he's almost he's not meant to be. And I see sometimes people that talk about him in comic books as a hero. He's a sociopath, a psychopath that happens to think he's doing good. If he is or isn't, that's a different story. But even with him, he believes that in this case, maybe it was for the best, but he's still going to tell people because that's him. He's uncompromising. So he tells Dr. Manhattan that you need to either kill me or let me go, but I am going to tell people, because whether this is right or it's wrong, or if this was what should have happened, it doesn't matter. That's not who I am. So he kills him. Um,
Well,
And in
let
that
me
case,
ask,
like I said,
let me ask you a question. So, you've got these graphic novels that basically, I mean, the ones that are the superheroes, no. It's loosely based on life, but
right.
the other ones like Persepolis, Mouse are based on realistic stories, somebody's biography.
hmm
Do you think that the problem was because they included the graphics? Like if these were just books rather than graphic novels or comic books, do you think that there would have been as much, you know, wanting to ban it
I
because it
don't
would have
think,
been just somebody's biography?
right. I don't think so because part of it, and it always tends to get there as well, is the intended audience. And, I think a lot of people, visual tends to incite more emotion, more, I don't know what to call it, than text, even though a good writer could write you a picture just as
Mhm.
easily as someone can paint it or draw it. But um, in that case, it was probably the depictions, the actual. And the thing is, like, and I read most of these as a young teenager. I didn't think they were that big of a deal as far as like graphic wise. I knew they were a big deal as far as comic book wise because
Mhm.
you don't, I never saw Spider-Man bash someone's head in, you things like that. Or the depictions in Sandman, for example. But, at the time, I was a young teenager and I had been reading Stephen King since probably 11 years old.
Mhm.
So I was very familiar with horror and I was very familiar with things like that. And it didn't bother me, but I imagine other people, um, obviously
With
it did.
the added images. Yeah.
Right.
Well, and I remember like back when you were saying in history, um, graphic novels and comic books were equated with bad. You're a delinquent, like you
Oh,
said,
right, right.
if you're reading it. So do you
Yeah.
think a lot of the banning had to do with the fact that people in charge still just didn't like the idea of it being a comic book?
Possibly. And again, like some of those themes, like with The Watchmen
Hmm.
and The Dark Knight, it's also, it invokes in some people that, and a lot of the stuff is there like anti-authority, against the current morals, against the current mores, things like that. That just irks some people like that.
Hmm.
And especially in that case when we're talking about superheroes, although, and the superheroes in Watchmen were completely created. They weren't anyone that was familiar. But I think it was just the idea. And also part of that though was to satirize superheroes. Watchmen was made to, in in some of these cases, just human people. And realistically, they're just human people that try to do good, but sometimes don't and are misguided and things happen. And like I said, the actual one that has those actual superpowers, he's not really human anymore. And he doesn't really have much of his humanity left. He's not he's not villainous. He doesn't go around killing people for the fun of it. He just
Hmm.
didn't want anything. He just thinks humans are kind of like trite and boring and they're petty little problems. So
Do you see the value? I mean, I see the value. Do you see the value of graphic novels and
yeah.
comic books,
Mhm.
especially in encouraging people to read?
Especially that because it does encourage people to read. Um, like I think part of my education was I kind of started off reading comic books to a degree, but then quickly went on to still reading comic books, but then going on novels. And we're talking like by the time I'm like 8 years old, I'm already reading novels. But it's because
Mhm.
I realized that text was just important as the visual. and words can give you just as much as a picture as the actual picture itself.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, there was a it keeps going on. There was a trend I know probably about 15 years ago, taking juvenile fiction and YAs and turning them into graphic novels.
mhm,
So, that was that's a big turnaround from when they were bad.
right.
You know.
And I think a lot of a lot of comic book and graphic novel stuff has become more so mainstream now that it is just part of the culture in general. And I mean, back then it was to a degree, but not as much as it is now. Like if I were to mention a particular superhero, say to my mom back then, she'd have no idea who I was talking to or talking about. But if I were to say now, it's like, oh, the one from the Avengers or something, or whatever Marvel movie or whatever. So things have obviously changed quite a bit. Um, and at the same time, I think some of these graphic novels did influence um, current like superheroes and comic books, for example, with like even though like say Spider-Man, we'll just take him. Even though he has all these superpowers, he still has all these other problems that superpowers just don't fix. You still have to deal with relationships. You still have to deal with work. You still have to deal with with
Right.
other than like I mean even like say Iron Man, who's Tony Stark is super wealthy. He still has to deal with the issues. In fact, well that was a little bit before then. Tony Stark, for example, has a real bad alcohol problem, and so that affects him. One of the superheroes was in Green Lantern. I mean, Green Arrow. It was one of his sidekicks or whatever. He develops a heroin addiction. You know.
That'll be banned next year then.
Well, and that was back in
Hmm.
like 1982, I think, or 83. So, but it started in being like that towards about that time where just kind of, I guess the word I want to use is like cheesy and hokey superhero types um, became more human and had just human problems just like anyone else did. Um,
Probably the Watchmen and Mouse and Persepolis showed
yeah,
you can do real stories.
and part of that, I mean, it has influenced other things. Like I said, for Sandman, there's been even like so many um, not 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 like even TV shows that have come out from it, from the characters from there. And I can't remember the other one. I talked about it with actually with Brandy the other day. I think it was on HBO like 2 years ago. The one with about the angel and the devil. I can't remember his name. I know, but all
You're
these
the
others.
graphic novel guru, not me.
Well, in that case, it's like I said, it's part of it went into movies and TV shows and stuff like that too, because they're able to translate that into it. So,
Before we
um,
go, I want to show everybody, we do have these books
mhm,
here. That this is Watchmen and Batman, The Dark Knight Returns, Persepolis, Mouse, and the Sandman.
mhm.
So we do have these here, and we are running out of time. So I know you love talking about graphic novels.
Oh,
So,
Good Omens. That's what it was. It was called Good Omens. Okay.
oh, that's right. We do have that one too. We do have
Yeah,
that
yeah.
one too.
So,
Yeah.
but
So,
yeah,
and
so
uh,
it's fun to talk about it.
well, thank you very much for talking to us about the graphic novels that we've had. Remember, guys, we've got all these books. They're either on the tables, a lot of them are checked out. So if you don't see them on the tables, look in the catalog and we probably have it back on the shelves. Um, they're banned books. They've not burst into flames yet.
Not yet.
No. Well, before we go, guys, I want to remind you of a few events. Thank you, Ash, for,
You're very welcome.
doing this with us. This tomorrow, we're going to have a pre-recorded event at noon. It's called Band Book Talks, and CTC communications professors are going to talk about their banned books. And you'd be surprised what was banned and what they're going to talk about. We also have on the agenda that we have Harker Heights Animal Shelter that's supposed to be here at 12:30 with adoptable animals. Just want to let you know the forecast is rain and storming. And if it is raining and storming, we're going to have to cancel that. But if they want, if they can make it, they will be on the porch of the library. We also, today is the last day to send in your pet photos. So you email them to reference request at ctcd.edu. And even if we don't have the actual animal shelter here, we will be choosing winners for the silliest, the best themed, and the cutest. So make sure you get your photos in, and we'll have prizes for each of them. Monday, even though the library is closed, because it was pre-recorded, we have artist Mario Monguia, who has he did a demonstration of his doing some of his sculpture and why he does it. And that will be uploaded on Monday on our Facebook. And again, all these do end up on our YouTube. So we have that on Monday. So make sure you watch it. If you don't watch it on Monday, watch it when you come back on Tuesday. Then on that Wednesday, we have Doctors Leanne Temple and Dr. Frew, who used to be Dr. Samaripa, and they're going to be talking about their journey to getting their PhD in EDD. It's not hard when you work. I mean, it's not easy when you're working full time, you have children, to be able to just do it. So they kind of talk about how they were able to accomplish all of that in spite of everything else. So it's very inspirational speakers for that as well. Also, on the schedule for October 12th, we have our Poetry Slam and open mic. Make sure if you want to participate that you go to our events page and register. The only way that you're able to perform that day is if you are registered. So we need you guys to just, if you want to do music, you want to do dance, you want to do poetry, whatever you want to do, you need to register for that. So that's all I have. Thank you again, Ash. All of us rebels over here with banned books. So if y'all ever have any questions, Alyssa, are there any questions at the moment?
No, there's not.
Okay. All right. So you know where to find Ash. He's at the library. If you have any questions about graphic novels, he's the man to see. So, all right. Thank you again. And you guys have an awesome day. And I really do think rain is coming, which might mean pets aren't coming, but we also need the rain too. So think positively. Both are good. It's a win-win. So, all right. And we'll see you guys next time. Y'all have a great day.
Bye, y'all.
Thanks again.